You've probably seen the trailers for the new movie. But long before Hollywood, there was a story so powerful it has survived for 3,000 years. One king leaves for war. It takes him 10 years to win it, and then 10 more years just to sail home, because the gods themselves are against him. He will face a one-eyed giant, a witch who turns men into pigs, monsters, and the land of the dead itself. He will lose every single one of his men. His name is Odysseus, and this is the real story of the Odyssey.
Our hero is Odysseus, the king of a small rocky island called Ithaca. He wasn't the strongest warrior in Greece, or the fastest. His weapon was his mind. Odysseus was famous for being the cleverest, most cunning man alive, a master of tricks and clever plans. In fact, it was his idea that finally won the 10-year Trojan War, the legendary wooden horse. A giant hollow horse the Greeks used to sneak soldiers inside the walls of Troy. But being clever wasn't going to be enough for what came next, because the journey home was about to become the most dangerous adventure in all of mythology.
Let's rewind for a second, because the story really begins with Odysseus's greatest trick of all. For 10 long years, the Greek army had been stuck outside the mighty walls of Troy, unable to break in. It was Odysseus who finally ended it. He had the Greeks build an enormous, hollow wooden horse, hide their best soldiers inside, and pretend to sail away, leaving the horse behind as a gift. The Trojans, thinking they had won, dragged it inside their own walls and celebrated. That night, the soldiers crept out and opened the gates from within. Troy fell in a single night. It was the ultimate proof that Odysseus's mind was more dangerous than any sword. With the war finally won, Odysseus and his men set sail for home. Their very first stop set the tone for everything to come. They landed at a city belonging to a people called the Cicones and raided it. Odysseus told his men to grab the treasure and leave fast. But they didn't listen. They stayed to feast and drink. The Cicones came back with reinforcements, counterattacked, and drove the Greeks back to their ships, killing many. It was the first hard lesson of the journey. When Odysseus's men ignored him, people died. And they were about to ignore him again and again. Storms blew the ships off course to a strange, peaceful island, the land of the Lotus-Eaters. The people there weren't violent at all, but they offered Odysseus's men a taste of the lotus plant, and anyone who ate it fell into a blissful daze and completely forgot about their home, their families, everything. They just wanted to stay and eat lotus forever. Odysseus had to physically drag his weeping men back to the ships and tie them down to stop them from staying behind. It's one of the story's oldest warnings. Sometimes the thing that destroys you isn't a monster. It's the temptation to give up and forget where you're going. Then they reached the island of the Cyclopes, enormous one-eyed giants. Curious, Odysseus and a few men explored a giant cave full of cheese and sheep. It belonged to Polyphemus, a Cyclops who was a son of the sea god Poseidon. When the giant came home, he rolled a boulder over the entrance, a boulder so massive no human could move it, trapping them inside. Then, to their horror, Polyphemus grabbed 2 of the men and ate them alive. Odysseus's men were doomed. They couldn't fight the giant because if they killed him, they'd never move the boulder. Odysseus needed a plan. And what he came up with is one of the most famous tricks in all of history. To understand why the Cyclops is the story's greatest villain, you have to understand one sacred rule of the ancient Greek world: hospitality. Guests were considered protected by the gods themselves. A host was expected to feed and shelter any stranger who arrived at his door, and a guest was expected to be respectful in return. It was one of the most important laws in all of Greek life, and Polyphemus, the Cyclops, breaks it in the most horrifying way possible, by eating his guests. In the eyes of the Greeks, that is what made him a true monster. Not because he was big, but because he had no honor. Odysseus offered the giant some incredibly strong wine. Polyphemus loved it and drank until he was drunk, and he asked the stranger his name.
Odysseus smiled and answered, "My name is Nobody." When the Cyclops passed out, Odysseus and his men took a huge wooden stake, sharpened it, hardened the tip in the fire, and drove it straight into the giant's single eye, blinding him. Polyphemus screamed in agony, and the other Cyclopes came running, shouting through the boulder, "Who is hurting you?" And the blind giant roared back, "Nobody! Nobody is hurting me!" So they shrugged and walked away. The trick had worked perfectly. But now they still had to get out. The next morning, the blind giant let his sheep out to graze, feeling their backs to check no one was riding them. But Odysseus had tied his men underneath the sheep's bellies. They slipped out and raced to the ship. And here, Odysseus made the worst mistake of his life. As they sailed away, he couldn't resist gloating, and he shouted his real name across the water. "It was Odysseus who blinded you!" Big mistake, because now the giant knew exactly who to curse. Polyphemus prayed to his father, the sea god Poseidon, begging him to make sure Odysseus lost everything, and wandered for years before reaching home alone. And Poseidon heard him. From that moment, the sea itself was Odysseus's enemy. By now you might be wondering, why don't the gods just let Odysseus go home? The truth is, the gods are the real players in this story, and they are divided. The sea god Poseidon absolutely hates Odysseus for blinding his son, and does everything in his power to drown him. But the goddess Athena, the goddess of wisdom, loves Odysseus precisely because he is so clever, and she protects him again and again. The whole Odyssey is really a tug-of-war between these two powerful gods, with one mortal man caught in the middle, just trying to get home to his family. Next, they came to the floating island of Aeolus, the keeper of the winds. Aeolus liked Odysseus and gave him an amazing gift, a leather bag containing all the stormy winds trapped inside. All Odysseus had to do was keep it closed, and a gentle breeze would carry them home. For 9 days they sailed, and on the 10th day they could actually see the shores of Ithaca. Home, so close. Odysseus, exhausted, fell asleep, and his crew, convinced the secret bag was full of gold he was hiding from them, opened it. Every storm wind burst out at once and blasted the ships all the way back to where they started. They had thrown away their home with their own hands. Here's your first question. What clever name did Odysseus tell the Cyclops so the other giants wouldn't come to help? Was it A, Hercules, B, Nobody, or C, the King? I'll give you a moment to think. The answer is B, Nobody. It's one of the smartest tricks ever told. Their wandering brought them to the island of a witch goddess named Circe. She invited a group of Odysseus's men to a feast, then waved her wand and turned them all into pigs, trapping them in a pen. Odysseus went to rescue them, but on the way, the god Hermes stopped him and gave him a magical herb called moly to protect him from her magic. When Circe's spell failed on Odysseus, she was so amazed that she turned his men back into humans and welcomed them. They ended up staying on her island, feasting for an entire year. But Ithaca was still calling, and to get there, Circe told Odysseus, he would first have to do something no living man was supposed to do. Circe told Odysseus he must sail to the very edge of the world and enter the underworld, the land of the dead, to speak with the ghost of a blind prophet named Tiresias. So Odysseus did the unthinkable. He sailed to the realm of the dead and called up the spirits. There, the prophet Tiresias revealed the truth. It was Poseidon, furious over his blinded son, who was punishing them. He warned Odysseus of the trials still to come, but promised that if his men could control themselves, Odysseus would one day reach home, reclaim his palace, and take his revenge. Armed with the prophecy, Odysseus sailed back to the world of the living, straight toward the most beautiful and deadly sound in the world. Next came the Sirens, creatures whose song was so beautiful that any sailor who heard it would steer his ship onto the rocks to get closer and die. But Odysseus wanted to hear that song and live. So he came up with a plan. He plugged all his men's ears with wax so they couldn't hear a thing. but he had them tie him tightly to the mast and ordered them not to release him no matter how much he begged. As they sailed past, the Sirens sang, promising Odysseus they would tell him every secret of the world. He screamed and struggled to be set free, but his men only tied the ropes tighter and rowed on until the song faded. He had heard the impossible and survived. Question 2. To safely hear the Sirens' deadly song and live, what did Odysseus do? A. Blocked his own ears. B. Had himself tied to the mast. Or C. Sailed a different way. Think about it. The answer is B. He had himself tied to the mast, while his crew's ears were plugged with wax. Now came an impossible choice. Odysseus had to sail through a narrow channel, guarded on one side by Scylla, a monster with 6 horrible heads, and on the other by Charybdis, a giant whirlpool that could swallow an entire ship. Circe had warned him, you cannot avoid both. If he sailed too close to the whirlpool, he'd lose everyone. So Odysseus made the brutal decision to sail past the 6-headed monster instead, knowing it would cost him. As they rowed by, Scylla's 6 heads darted down and snatched 6 of his men, 1 for each mouth, carrying them away screaming. It was a horrifying price, but it saved the rest of the ship. Sometimes a leader has to choose the least terrible option. They landed on an island belonging to Helios, the sun god, where his sacred cattle grazed. Both the prophet and the witch had given Odysseus one absolute rule: do not touch these cattle. He made his men swear an oath, but then storms trapped them on the island for a whole month. Their food ran out, and they began to starve. While Odysseus slept, his desperate men broke their oath and killed and ate the sacred cattle. The sun god was enraged and demanded justice from Zeus, king of the gods. And when they finally set sail, Zeus hurled down a thunderbolt that shattered the ship and drowned every single man. Every one, except Odysseus. Now he was truly alone. Clinging to a piece of wreckage, Odysseus washed up on the island of a nymph named Calypso. And here, the story becomes strange. Calypso fell in love with him and kept him on her island for 7 long years. She even offered him the ultimate gift: to make him immortal, to live forever, young and safe, if he would just stay with her and forget Ithaca. Think about that. Eternal life. No more suffering, no more danger. And Odysseus said no. Every day he sat on the shore, staring across the sea toward a home he might never see again, weeping. He would rather be a mortal man who dies, in his own home with his own family, than a god who forgets who he is. Finally, the gods took pity and ordered Calypso to let him go. Last question. Calypso offered Odysseus something almost no one would ever refuse. What was it? A. A fleet of golden ships. B. To live forever as an immortal. Or C. An army. The answer is B. To live forever. And incredibly, he said no. He chose home instead. But what was happening back home all this time? Ithaca was in trouble. Everyone assumed Odysseus was dead, and his palace had been invaded by dozens of arrogant nobles, the Suitors, who all wanted to marry his wife, Queen Penelope, and take his throne. They lived in his house, ate his food, and refused to leave until she chose one of them. But Penelope was as clever as her husband. She told them she would choose a new husband as soon as she finished weaving a burial shroud. So every day she wove it, and every single night she secretly unraveled her work so it was never finished. For 3 years the trick held, until a servant betrayed her secret. Meanwhile, their son, the young prince Telemachus, was growing desperate. It was time for the king to come home. And we have to talk about Penelope, because she is just as much the hero of this story as Odysseus. For 20 years, she runs the kingdom alone, holds off a mob of aggressive suitors, and refuses to give up hope that her husband is still alive. Her weapon, like his, is her mind. The trick with the weaving, pretending to work on the shroud by day and secretly unraveling it by night, is pure Odysseus-level cunning. The ancient Greeks saw them as the perfect match. Two of the cleverest minds in the world, kept apart for 2 decades, each staying loyal and each outsmarting everyone around them. At last, Odysseus reached the shores of Ithaca, 20 years after he first left for war. But he couldn't just walk in. The palace was full of enemies. So, helped by the goddess Athena, he disguised himself as an old, ragged beggar and slipped into his own home completely unrecognized. And here is the most heartbreaking moment in the whole epic. As the disguised beggar walked in, one creature knew him instantly. His old hunting dog, Argos, whom he had raised as a puppy 20 years before. Now ancient, sick, and neglected, Argos lifted his head, recognized his master, and wagged his tail with joy. Odysseus, unable to reveal himself, could only look away and wipe a single tear. And, having seen his master come home at last, the old dog Argos closed his eyes and died. Finally, Penelope announced a contest to end it. She brought out Odysseus's own great bow and set up a row of 12 axe heads. Whoever could string the mighty bow and shoot a single arrow cleanly through all 12 would win her hand. One by one, the arrogant suitors tried. And one by one, they failed. Not one of them was even strong enough to bend the bow. Then the old beggar asked for a turn. The suitors laughed at him. But the ragged old man picked up the great bow, and with one smooth motion, strung it and fired an arrow straight through all 12 axe heads. The laughter stopped, because there was only one man alive who could do that. The beggar rose to his feet and threw off his disguise. The king had come home. What happened next was pure fury. Odysseus turned the great bow on the suitors, who had eaten his food and courted his wife for years. Together with his son Telemachus and 2 loyal servants, and with the goddess Athena shielding them and shattering the enemy's courage, Odysseus fought the entire mob of suitors in his own great hall and defeated them all. After 20 years of war, monsters, witches, and the sea, the king had finally, violently, taken back his own home. But one test remained, and it was the hardest of all. Because his wife Penelope, who had waited 20 years, refused to believe this stranger was really her husband. So how much of this actually happened? Well, the monsters and the gods are myth, of course. But the world behind the story was very real. For a long time, people thought Troy was just a legend, until archaeologists dug up the ruins of a real ancient city in what is now Turkey, matching Homer's descriptions almost exactly. The Odyssey itself was passed down by memory, spoken aloud for generations before it was ever written down, around 3,000 years ago, credited to a blind poet named Homer. In other words, this may be humanity's oldest great adventure story, and we are still retelling it today. Penelope had been fooled by liars for 20 years, so she would not be tricked now. To test this man, who claimed to be Odysseus, she calmly ordered a servant to move their marriage bed out of the bedroom for him. And Odysseus reacted with shock, because that was impossible. He himself had built their bed, and one of its posts was a living olive tree rooted in the ground. The bed could never be moved. Only the real Odysseus could know that secret. And with that, Penelope finally broke down and threw her arms around her husband, after 20 long years apart. After everything, the war, the giant, the witch, the whirlpool, the land of the dead. The story of the Odyssey isn't really about monsters at all. It's about a man who would rather be mortal and go home than be a god and forget who he is. That is why, 3,000 years later, we are still telling it, and why they keep making it into movies. So here's my question for you. Which trial would have been the hardest for you to survive? Tell me in the comments. And if you want more legends and rulers who once ran the world, subscribe. Once they ruled. See you in the next one.